Okay, I don't know. Think we should probably get started. The rate of new people has reduced, so I assume at least we can start with the intro and bio. Hi, welcome to the History Workshops webinar series for the second semester. Today is our first installation. We're very excited to have Stefan Norgaard joining us from Guatemala. And my name is Kasonde Mkonde. I'm a PhD student in the History Workshop and History Department. Without further ado, I think I'm going to introduce Stefan. I read his bio. So Stefan is a PhD student in urban planning at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. And he expects to graduate in 2024. His research interests include urban and planning theory, local government and planning law, and mixed methods research focused on planning practice and urban governance in the related but distinct late liberal contexts of South Africa, the United States, and Mexico. Stefan is passionate about good urban governance and participatory democratic practice, and particularly how cities' public-private arrangements affect equitable development outcomes. For his dissertation, he plans to examine spatial planning and political economy in former South African Bantustan capital cities. So before handing over to Stefan, I'm just going to remind people of some of our sort of housekeeping things. We'll have 20 minutes presentation from Stefan, and while the presentation is going on, please feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll monitor those. And after the 20 minutes, we'll open up to discussion. Please note that this session is being recorded and the recording will be shared on the History Workshops social media platforms. So I'll hand over to Stefan.
All right, thank you, Kasonde, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully, folks can see this. And
looks great.
Is that awesome?
Yeah.
Thanks, Kasonde. So yeah, thank you to all the folks at the WITS History Workshop, Laura Phillips, Ariana Lasoni, Jogu Morgan, Noor Niftagodjian, and the many others who invited me and gave me this fantastic opportunity to present. And thanks to all of you for joining as well. I know that many of you know Johannesburg and particularly Ponte far better than I do. And so I'm really eager for critical feedback on framing, on the embodied life of Ponte in a Johannesburg context, and more. And I also look forward to a chat and discussion after the presentation, which will be about just under 20 minutes, as Kasonde mentioned. So first, a little bit about me. As Kasonde mentioned, I'm a PhD student in urban planning at Columbia. And in this particular inquiry, I'm curious about the relationships between a single built structure, in this case, Ponte Towers, and what we might call the environments of governance or the institutional arrangements of a nation state that connect that particular built structure with a broader political economy and set of institutions, in this case of the Grand Apartheid South African moment. And the question is really the extent to which a building's symbolic and experience meaning relates to or can overcome the aspirations and ambitions of its architects and planners. And in this case, we can get a window into those ambitions through a particular document, a 1975 Planning and Building Development Report, which was linked in the registration email. So please feel free to open up the original PDF as well, if that's of interest as we're speaking. And there are also promotional brochures from the early 1970s, one from 1973 in particular, and a series of conversations with the photographer and artist Mikhael Subotzky, all of which help show the clash between Ponte as aspiration and Ponte as enacted and experienced, which are quite different indeed, and the multiple layers of mediatic narratives that embody Ponte and enliven it with new narratives and meaning of its own. So ultimately, I find that the window into this aspiration of the mid-1970s reveals a paranoid and panoptic desire on behalf of South African governmentality to regulate and control space. And we see that even at the micro level of Ponte City itself in its planning and structure. And we also are able to see a desire to shape South African subjectivities along a very homogeneous and rigid racial and ethnic and social class line. So in this presentation, I will begin by looking at some of the historical and archival documents that give us a window into the aspirations of Ponte by the architects and design team. And then I will take a look at some seminal urban theoretic contributions from Foucault, Timothy Mitchell, Brian Larkin, and James Scott, Seeing Like a State, and then look at the multiple and subsequent reappropriations that are often from below, from Ponte residents themselves over time, that then inhabit Ponte with new meaning that is both lived and symbolic for its residents, for residents of Johannesburg, and for South Africans. And so ultimately, I find that Ponte reflects, absorbs, and renders meaningful various contestations, various struggles for power, dignity, and livelihood in Johannesburg. So to start with this historical and archival foray of Ponte as aspiration and what the planners, architects, and design team envisioned Ponte to be when it was constructed in the early 1970s and when it opened for residents in 1975. This planning and development work speaks to those aspirations. The document is seemingly banal and technical and apolitical, and indeed there are a number of details that are quite interesting. So, for example, the fact that the building itself is hollow was in fact seemingly partly by happenstance due to the size of the plot. And oh, I see that I'm going to switch off my video just for a stronger connection. Yeah, due to the size of the lot and requirements such that rooms must face onto natural light. But a slightly deeper investigation also reveals a number of more sinister contestations going on in the original vision of the building. So correspondence with the Department of Native Affairs, for example, shows how Rodney Groskov and Manfred Hermer, the design team, were asking about where non-white South African servants might live to create the quote unquote least visual nuisance. And that was ultimately determined by both the Department of Native Affairs, the city of Johannesburg, and the architects and design teams to be deep in the core of the building. Yet municipal bylaws also played a role. Groskopf notes that the sills of the windows had to be at least 6 foot high so that the black staff could not look at the white apartments. But with the main internal security booth facing inward in the hollow core, it was quite easy for the securitized team of watchmen to look internally at all of the corridors to make sure that the building staff were dutifully working. And at the same time, building residents on the upper floors could look across the building and see other residents on other floors. Also, there is a vertical hierarchy present in the planning and aspiration of Ponte that might mirror an unequal Grand Apartheid South African society. On the lower floors, the apartments were somewhat modest, but after the 15th and 17th floors, extra bedrooms. And by the top, multi-story apartments. Indeed, the grand apartments of them all, the Palazzo de Paradiso, were multi-story apartments filled with wine cellars, saunas, patio braai areas, roof decks, and some even a tennis court. And so residents were able not only to look inward and surveil other residents of the building, but they could also look outward and see the entire Witwatersrand and aspects of the Transvaal from their penthouse apartments. And then following Scott, Ponte also existed as an island or a sanctuary. So indeed, the fact that the building came complete with a 50-shop mall, a bowling alley, and a concert venue meant that this was a little island of aspiration, a sort of white whale of everything that South African society could be for this creme de la creme, with a full on-site security team at entrance and exit. Here we see some pictures of Ponte in the 1970s. The shag carpeting and aesthetics of the moment are on full display. And these are some screenshots from that 1975 Planning and Building Development Report. Again, please feel free to peruse the PDF now or later. The report, again, it seems rather technical. Another interesting insight are the advertisements buttressing either side of the document. Here we see a real window into the absurdity and immensity of the project. So for example, vendors advertise Ponte-specific safe door designs, aerial communication television installment systems for the building's upper residents, and custom window cleaning services by the Riggers Steeplejacks company. And so here we see that Ponte was really designed in a rather intentional and custom way for the system's elite. And it was also designed to function as a prestigious building in this moment. Now, let's take a pause and examine the architect and design team. This is Manfred Hermer, Manny Feldman, and Rodney Grosskopf. The original design team continues to practice today, although two of the three, Hermer and Feldman, have since passed. GLH Associates remains an active enterprise and has throughout the 1980s and 1990s assembled buildings across the world, including in Kuwait, in Dubai, and in Israel. And so we see that other noted projects include the Market Theatre and Civic Theatre complexes, the Durban Velodrome, and a number of very prestigious buildings within the Johannesburg and South African built environment. Yet the architects and design teams were not only constructing Ponte in this moment, they were also active social critics, weighing in on some of the major debates around South Africa, racial inequality and integration, and the built environment in this moment. And so as one example, this screenshot in the center is a picture of Manfred Hermer's book, The Passing of Pageview. And so Hermer illustrated and wrote this book, and it really bemoans the demolition of Pageview and its commercial corridor, ultimately giving way to Triumph, a far more sanitized and sterile Group Areas Act casualty. And here, Hermer is taking a very public stance on the Group Areas Act at really the same time. The book was published in '78. So this is happening rather in parallel with a lot of the ambition and aspiration of Ponte Towers. And it's worth kind of thinking through that tension and complexity. At the same time, we have Rodney Grosskopf, who later in 2010 published this book, Carved in Stone, which is, quote, a series of profiles on some of the famous characters who helped develop and mold the history and culture of South Africa. They include Freemasons like Francis William Reeds, Chief Justice and collaborator with the English and Dutch. Afrikaner bonds is a major theme of the book. And here, Grosskopf is very focused on this concept of winning the peace and thinking about governance in South Africa through nonviolent means. And so we might think about, in Carved in Stone, the relationship between winning the peace through nonviolent means and architectural and constructive projects like Ponte City. The architect and design team also got plenty of criticism for things like the Market and Civic Theatre complex, as we see in this 1960s Variety magazine article. It's worth noting that this is late modernism or brutalist architecture at its best or worst, depending on how we think about it. And so with Ponte and with other structures, there was certainly plenty of spirited public debate. These quotes come from a 1973 promotional brochure. And here we see documents aimed at the potential clientele, the residents of Ponte, or at least the envisioned residents in the early 1970s of who might live in Ponte. And here we see highlighted just a number of references, even on the first page of the brochure, to the building's size, its immensity, its huge dimensions, its generous expanse. And so there's a persistent effort or perhaps paranoia with the planning and envisionment of Ponte to focus on its size, its immensity, and indeed perhaps a concern that South Africa might not be in full development with comparison with global north urban centers. So to place this in some urban theory contributions with literature from James Scott, Timothy Mitchell, and Foucault, as well as Brian Larkin and Felicity Scott, we can think about this moment of grand or high apartheid institutions. And Ponte, in this context, exists in dialectical conversation with other interventions in the built environment. Rectilinear town planning in townships, as well as some slum clearances with Group Areas Act, pass laws and governmentality, and the Bantustan and hostile regimes as well, all of which in different but related ways sought to shape subjectivities and control, order, and manage, or in the words of Timothy Mitchell, make legible the population from above. And of course, with Brian Larkin, we can look at how buildings do not just take on a political aesthetic meaning, but they're fashioned, form as a dynamic relationship between infrastructure and user. And the Hillbrow neighborhood in this moment really speaks to that. It was a countercultural Greenwich Village of Johannesburg, a sort of liberal or less regulated space. And yet, amidst all of this, Ponte, of course, existed as a sort of safe, luxurious, and contained, securitized island. Right near, but separate from Hillbrow. And so even though we have from above a set of very rigid aspirations and ambitions about what Ponte ought to mean, Ponte as lived never really met or meshed with this vision from above. And so situating it in historical context is really important as we look at the building as lived by Ponte's various layers of residence over time. So as I mentioned, Ponte was one micro-intervention in the built environment that existed in conversation with these others. Certainly, Jennifer Robinson and Lindsay Bremner and many others look at how control and management of the built environment and urban planning were key technologies of governance in this moment. And at the same time, the political aesthetic regime of late modernism is on full display, not just in Ponte, but through a variety of these other projects. Yet from below, there were a number of counterconducts and resistances that were both explicit and subtle in nature. And so we might think about the timeline of Ponte. It opened to residents in 1975. And Noor Nifshagodian is here on the line, right? As early as 1976, we have the Soweto uprisings and counterconducts to this rigid control and regulation of space. At the same time, in Ponte, Crankshaw and White write about quote unquote latent mixity in the building. So from the very beginning, you had Syrian, Lebanese, Portuguese, South Africans, recent immigrants passing as white. You have the capacity limits that were envisioned by the architecture and design folks who constructed the building really falling by the wayside as landlords sought to fill the building. And starting in the 1980s, well before the pacted transition to democracy, you started to see urban flight, particularly by elite white residents, to what Teresa Caldera calls fortified enclaves in the suburbs. And so this just made it more and more difficult for the Ponte City structure to live up to its very high white utopian and exclusionary aspirations. And indeed, at the same time here, you have mirrored in Ponte's built structure a set of global counterconducts, ranging from, in the 1950s, the Freedom Charter and then the Rivonia trials, to a number of different debates globally and within South Africa in the 1980s about inclusion and democracy. And so this leads us to a set of interesting conversations about the new and layered meanings of Ponte City in Johannesburg and in South Africa between the Grand Apartheid era and now, that I argue mirror in very complex and uneven ways the institutional transformations of South African society. So as the demographic transition of Hillbrow and the northern CBD of Johannesburg quickly changed from white to mixed race and then to African immigrant, Mikhael Subotzky calls Ponte in the early 1990s through today a sort of quote unquote Ellis Island of Johannesburg. You have Nigerian, Congolese, Zimbabwean immigrants and others from Mozambique as well. And in this moment, Ponte City sort of transforms itself from a symbol of white excess and utopia or utopian aspiration to one of a xenophobic dystopia, or perhaps a symbol of racialized fear, all that is wrong with the messy early 1990s democratic transitions in Johannesburg. And here the specter of crime following Gregory Marinick grows, particularly in Hillbrow, and Ponte starts to take on a sort of role as a site of mythic lore, larger than life. And many of these stories are actually demonstrably false or unverifiable at the least. For example, those about the trash on the building stacked 14 stories tall, or people committing suicide from the upper stories of the buildings. Though there were a number of reports showing upwards of 10,000 folks were living in the building when an original capacity was only about 3,500. And here we see from Suzanne Whitby a number of photos of Ponte in the early 1990s as the landlords and management team grew to struggle to manage the building in the same rigid way it had in the 70s and 80s. But Ponte continued to take on this large and perhaps frenzied media life. Here is a list of all the different movies, books, and photojournalistic projects that feature Ponte centrally. So again, here we have Ponte as a stage of the kind of changing institutional moments and apparatus of South African society, and a sort of challenging set of meanings for what the building could possibly mean in this context. But following Thomas Keenan, there was also a role for counter-forensics. And so what Keenan means by counter-forensics is using the double-edged sword of documentation and documentality to create a new political and ideological meaning for a particular site or object, and in this case, the building. And so what we have with Subotzky and Waterhouse's project is actually a photojournalistic project that mirrors the very mechanical precision of the building and the structure of Ponte as envisioned by the architects and design team. Subotzky and Waterhouse photographed every window, every apartment, and most every resident. And these photos from the middle here in the center of the screen show some of the results of Subotzky and Waterhouse's photojournalistic or artistic project. And what Subotzky and Waterhouse's project does is it humanizes the residents of Ponte and kind of takes off the stage or the mask of Ponte as dystopian nightmare, and shows instead that Ponte is sort of a banal utopia, or following Foucault, a heterotopia, meaning different things for different people. But it's home to a variety of working class Johannesburg residents trying to make it in an increasingly unequal city. And from here, we have a whole set of new and layered meanings for Ponte as well. On the left, we see a Cadbury chocolates commercial featuring Ponte as a site of multiracial integration. But we also start to see from possibilities of creating Ponte as a prison, new postmodern aspirations to make Ponte a luxury high density residential site of living once again. And so the London-based Kempston Group sought to envision a climbing gym and a huge childcare facility with restaurants and spas. But ultimately, this project by the Kempston Group crashed in the 2008 crisis, and it didn't stop there being over 1,000 evictions with Red Ant eviction teams going through the building. And that yet once again, Ponte kind of defied expectations, did not become a luxury site of high density living, and then has settled into its current place today in a part of South African society that's certainly very dynamic. It would be challenging to call contemporary South African society neoliberal, given that there's state fracture and attempts at state capture. But Ponte City exists at once as this banal utopia, yet at the same time, and following my conversations with Subotzky, very much retains some of the original hierarchy from the architects and design team. And so you have elite or wealthier South Africans who have chosen to live on the penthouse floors. Nick Bauer and other tourists and white South Africans take their turns on the top floors, while working class residents still live in the lower levels. And so we might ask, what is Ponte today? Is it this heterotopia? Is it an enduring securitized panopticon? The husband and wife management team that currently run Ponte do it rather safely, but there remain, and these pictures show, very biometric retinal and or fingerprint scans to enter the building and very strict policies on visitors and guests. And we might also ask the extent to which Ponte today has overcome the planners and architects' original aspirations, or whether it indeed is constrained by those initial plans and aspirations. And it's worth thinking about Ponte in conversation with other contemporary interventions, like the Hallmark House and Propertuity's Maboneng Precinct, which are also rising and falling with the institutional winds of South African society quite rapidly. Of course, David Adjei's Hallmark House is proudly inclusive and multiracial, and the building is filled with plants and is black, not white or off-white concrete, yet nonetheless is a high-density residential and kind of island-like project with its own facilities, its own cafes, and different complexes that can exist as this kind of luxurious island of privilege amidst a larger neighborhood, New Doornfontein, of challenge, of struggle. And so we might ask, these two buildings exist in kind of visual conversation off Joe Slovo Drive. What might this mean for Ponte today and Hallmark House, even as the meanings of Maboneng and Propertuity are changing with the recent liquidation of many buildings? And so in conclusion, going back to this original research question about the extent to which buildings embodied or subjective lives are shaped by the physical forms, the environments of governance, or the institutional arrangements in the society writ large, the planners and architects' ambitions, or residents themselves seeking to make and remake the building's meanings, it's clear that the meaning of Ponte is hardly static or predetermined. And indeed, planners and historians alike should take seriously the relationships between built structures, environments of governance, and counterconducts from below. And indeed, I would argue today that Ponte and apartheid have certainly failed, and the building today with its residents is a real testament to that failure, yet is also a real testament to the enduring physical and subjective legacies of apartheid governmentality today. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Really fascinating presentation, and thank you for sticking to time. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have a question, please, you can raise your hand. So Stefan's presentation on Ponte City, and I have been to Ponte on a tour, and I found it interesting that when I was on the tour like a couple of years ago, the tour guide actually told us these stories about, in the 90s, stacks of trash 40 floors high. And it's interesting that these stories are still being told when clearly false, right? Stefan, thanks for the presentation again. So Stefan talked about Ponte as a sort of utopian vision when it was built in the mid-70s, and then unpacked that with how it was actually lived. He further went to talk about the counter-conducts, this sort of idea from Foucault of how people actually used the space immediately after it was, almost immediately after it was constructed, because you had 76, you had people in Ponte actually subverting the youth, colored people passing as white, etc., exceeding the number of residents who were allowed. And then Stefan talked about appropriation and reappropriation of the building, asking the question, is Ponte, among other things, the Ellis Island of Johannesburg? And I actually have a question and comment about that after we hear from other people. And in conclusion, Stefan talked about, raises a few questions. Is Ponte a heterotopia? Is it viewed as a different thing depending on who maybe not so much the racial hierarchy today, but the socioeconomic hierarchy in the neoliberal situation? Or is it still a panopticon? You have this really intense securitization. This sort of the building owners really look at how many people are living there. There's like really intense security in terms of that, and how to get in. And but yeah, I find it interesting that it retains a hierarchy, but perhaps a sort of different hierarchy. Maybe we can talk about that later. And Stefan implores historians and people in architecture and design to think of buildings as not static, but take into account the dynamic nature of them, of how they're used and how people live there. Very fascinating presentation. We have one question from Tavis, so please go ahead. You can turn on your mic if your camera if you'd like to.
Thank you, Kasonde, and thank you, Stefan, for a very interesting and insightful history of Ponte City apartments. So mine is just a comment, really, and looking at what you've been sharing with us, and having come to Johannesburg and known Ponte City, like just seeing it from afar, how even now, currently, contemporarily, people come, like immigrants who are not familiar with Johannesburg, how they sort of use it as a sort of a campus. Let's say if you're getting lost, you always look at that tall building, and then so it gives you a sense of direction of where you're going. So I don't know how maybe that can also feature in your current analysis of it. And also just talking to people maybe who stay nearby, just what they think about that. And also, so it's sort of it's ironic for me, and sort of, I don't know if a paradox is the right term, how it was created as this utopia, but to add to the dystopia of how people would see it, or how the system would have seen it, how it's become sort of, it was created as a place to keep others outside, to keep the immigrants who were from the homelands, were non-citizens outside. But now it's sort of become, as I said, this campus. It gives a sense of direction where we're going, even for other immigrants. So I just like that paradox or irony about the current state of Ponte City. Thank you.
Okay, let me read the question in the chat or the comment before you respond to that. Thank you, Taviso. So from Josie Adler, the original target group of occupants were probably white Afrikaners settling in Johannesburg from east, west, south of the city, and nationally. I think it is unlikely that other whites would at the time think it luxury to move to the site adjacent to Lower Berea, Bertram's, Dorfontein. Do we know how many sites were owner-occupied in the initial period and then became rented out? Lost control of, as happened in most other inner city residential sectional title, and rental buildings. So yeah, do we know how many sites? I think that how many flats or units? Yeah, I don't know if you want to respond to those two, and then we'll go for another round.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks both Taviso and Josie. Those are great questions. Yeah, I agree, Taviso. The building is very visually distinctive, right? From within Hillbrow and pretty much many places within the CBD, and also in many Johannesburg suburbs on the northern side. And so I think thinking about Ponte as a physical compass and also as a symbolic or experiential compass is worth doing. And I definitely want to talk to residents both within and nearby. And then there are also a number of former residents with whom I'd love to speak. Those who lived in Ponte, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s, and then left, but still have a lot of attachment to it. I think Suzanne Whidby's work speaks to that a little bit, as does work by Gregory Marinik. In other words, there are residents who came to Ponte. It was a very enjoyable moment of living in Johannesburg, an urban lifestyle, and then left, whether it was because of feelings of safety or the specter of crime, in quotes here. And so what might that mean with their feelings and subjective experiences of Ponte over time? And I think that would definitely extend this project in useful ways. Josie, to your comment, I agree. And I think the dynamic of Afrikaners moving into Johannesburg from other rural areas in South Africa, and then the brochure and architect and design documents and the vision and aspiration of Ponte, I think speak to the perhaps intentionally ostentatious nature of Ponte City as this site of palatial luxury. And so it was the originally envisioned clientele was a group of, we might say, perhaps upwardly mobile white Afrikaner South Africans who were seeking life in the city and also economic opportunity in the Grand or High Apartheid set of institutions. But I think it is worth clarifying that, yeah, the term whites broadly defined definitely doesn't, it paints with quite a broad brush, because a lot of the neighborhood transitions were already underway well before the 1980s, in terms of, for example, folks leaving Jeppestown or New Doornfontein or even Hillbrow, which was already moving to this kind of more countercultural Greenwich Village as people were moving outward toward the suburbs. With regard to the question about owner versus renter occupied flats, Crankshaw and White have a really fantastic analysis of that for Hillbrow writ large, and that includes Ponte in the analysis, but I haven't been able to find any Ponte specific analysis of the status of the flats over time. And I agree that would be a really fantastic, that would be fantastic information to find.
All right, thanks a lot. I see a hand from Professor Noor Niftahoden. I think we'll take that one. Please go ahead, Prof.
Thanks, Kasonde, and thanks, Stefan. I've heard a couple of kind of comments and questions, I think. It's not surprising, it's about kind of the history of this. And it seems to me that there two tensions that I'd like you to comment on. The first is that you do present the kind of imagining and creation of Ponte, or you're locating it in this sort of, there's this kind of period of high apartheid, modernist planning, in which surveillance over the population, in particular the Black population, was a central element in the kind of ideology urban planning. And of course, the high moment of that was really in the establishment of townships in the 1950s and 1960s. And the 1960s do represent this kind of high moment of sort of the realization, albeit with all sorts of contradictions, of this modernist planning in which the kind of ideals of the panoptic are writ large in kind of various dimensions of urban planning. But the reality is this begins to, the kind of tensions in that begin to lead to an unraveling of this kind of system. And perhaps two ways of thinking through that process of unraveling. The first is, and you've already alluded to this, and Josie's question also speaks to it, and that is the kind of tension between what the state wanted to do and what white middle-class society was doing in terms of its place in the urban. It was moving out of the city center, right? So you have this moment in which this iconic building is imagined and established in the early 1970s, when the processes that appeared to inform its imagination and its construction are leading elsewhere, right? You have massive suburbanization, the kind of palatial housing is happening elsewhere, right, in the suburbs. And so one wonders, you know, why this moment is it's almost like a kind of residue of a kind of former moment, right? And then secondly, is a sort of, you know, you are locating it in kind of modernist apartheid, kind of a state project. But of course, Ponte is privately built, is driven by private enterprise. So I wonder, and at the same time, it's a point I was making earlier, that the kind of creation of white suburbia is happening elsewhere. Why is it that you have this kind of moment of investment by private firms drawing on this kind of urban imagination that you speak to, which is kind of produced, you know, largely in the 1940s, but is informed by kind of architectural urban planning that comes out of the 1920s. And it's beyond its high moment. Beyond its high moment, and you have this kind of high-rise building being put up in the 1970s. So it seems to me to be located in these kind of moments of contradiction, and which, as you say, you know, come to the fore quite starkly and powerfully in the late 70s, early 1980s. So it seems to me, if you could comment on this kind of moments of contradiction and what Ponte then represents, if that is the way one might imagine it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Niftagogen, for those comments. That's a fantastic framing of these contradictions. One of which is this periodization of grand or high apartheid and state projects vis-a-vis the reality of residential transition, and the second is this question of public-private collaboration and investment in the city over time. And I think that exactly as you said, the structure, Ponte is sort of late to the party of high modernism and of large-scale state projects of racialized utopia. And if this were a construction project envisioned in 1955 rather than 1975, it might better fit within the conventional periodization of grand or high apartheid versus the kind of struggle generation that followed. And so it almost seems like the project's visionaries were kind of ill-suited to the demographic realities taking place at the time. But of course, the transformations between the early to mid 1970s and the late 1970s, it might be possible that there was perhaps a hope that the grand or high apartheid project would continue in perhaps different but related ways, and that a set of new elite or elite aspiring white residents could occupy Ponte and enliven the kind of inner city or central business districts of Johannesburg, even as the reality on the ground was clearly showing this not to be the case from the very minute Ponte opened its doors. And then with regard to this question of Ponte being privately built, and so yet contrasts with a lot of the state projects of the moment, I think that's absolutely right, and also a contradiction here. And of course, it's worth noting that there was a lot of public-private collaboration or perhaps mutual assistance along the way, whether it was the Department of Native Affairs and a lot of the building bylaws with the discussions between the architects and design teams and city officials with Ponte, Or we also see this with Maboneng and Propertuity in the around 2010 or in the 20-teens, a bunch of public-private consultations, possibilities for special business district designations. And so while it was certainly a private-led and a private project with private investment, the public sector was all too eager to lend a hand in some ways. Yet we might ask of the architects and design team, what was the economic case for building Ponte at this time? And that's also a bit of a riddle.
Oh, okay. I see in the chat, Njogu has a question. Please, Prof. Noor, would you like to respond? And then I think your hand is still up, and then Njogu.
Yeah, it's not so much a response, it's just a kind of a follow-up to the public-private collaboration. I'm really curious about the position and the role that the Johannesburg City Council played in all of this. And that's important for a number of reasons, because it's at that level where kind of imaginings of the city and decisions about property investment would be located. And the Johannesburg City Council, for a long time imagined itself as standing against kind of the national government, apartheid government's ideals and objectives, right? So that again speaks about the ideology and the potential contradictions, but we also know that the city councils throughout Eastern and even today, and you're referring to Maboneng, how the city has worked with, collaborated with the private sector in driving particular modes of development and investment in property. So it'd be useful to understand the role of the Johannesburg City Council at this point in time, especially considering this kind of suburbanization that is happening, and also, and here, I wonder if you can draw on the kind of analyses of Martin Murray in relation to development in the city and his lens of real estate capitalism, and how, if one uses that lens, how one might understand this kind of investment in the city center and the partnering between the public and private sector in driving this kind of enormous investment in the city center at that time. Thanks.
Do you have anything to say, or should we take Njogu's question, Dr. Morgan? I think Njogu, you can go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Kasonde, and thank you, Stefan. It's a very interesting paper. I really enjoyed it.
Good morning.
I really enjoyed reading it, and I learned a lot. Thanks very much. I found it very ambitious. It's covering a lot of ground, drawing on, really trying to think about the changing political economy in the country and how that influences and affects the imaginations and the imaginaries of Ponte, and in particular, the users and the uses of Ponte. My specific question is, and perhaps it's by way of trying to tighten, which I think, a paper that I think is quite ambitious, is elsewhere or somewhere in your paper, you refer to other scholarship that has looked at Ponte Tower. It doesn't seem to be quite a central focus of what you're trying to do. But how would you say, how does your analysis engage with that kind of prior scholarship that has looked at Ponte in terms of the changing imaginations of its users and users over time? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Njogu, for that question. It's definitely something that scholars have written about, and there's some fantastic work, for example, by Gregory Marinik on the changing meanings of Ponte over time that I think situates itself more squarely on an analysis over time of the building itself and its meanings, without kind of zooming out to look at the institutional arrangements of South African society over time in the same way. And I think that's essential reading has been essential reading for me. I also think there are a number of less formal historical documents, and these include, for example, the internet blog post by Suzanne Whitby and others that actually bring perspectives from former residents of Ponte, kind of nostalgically looking back on their time in the building and commenting on its changing meaning. And I think those primary documents are essential. And of course, there's also scholarship that engages a changing Johannesburg in transition. And so you have, for example, Tomlinson, Beauregard et al., and Martin Murray, of course, that kind of are looking in this kind of more 1990s and 2000s period, and the changing meaning of property and building management in the city. And I think that's essential to emphasize as well. And then, of course, the historical and archival documents, for example, the 1975 Planning and Building and Development Report and the promotional brochure, et cetera. And yeah, I think the tension of which there are so many is at once the kind of narrow or concrete, so to speak, focus on the singular built structure of Ponte on the one hand, but on the other, the rather expansive focus on South African political economy and institutional arrangements over time, and trying to think about fitting one within the other. But of course, it's a very imperfect fit. It's Ponte is always at once out of step with national level institutional arrangements, yet very much elucidates them. And so that's, I think, the tension that I'm hoping to explore in the paper.
Oh, great. There's a comment from Luke. I'll read it out in the chat. I've heard commentators on Johannesburg history say that it is important to note that this round of massive building projects was indicative of a massive overinvestment by financial institutions in real estate that peaked in the late 1980s. This was supposedly a response in part to difficulties in finding other sites for investment in the stilted apartheid-era economy. And another comment from Alison Wilson: it is interesting that Ponte has survived compared with other buildings in the area that were abandoned, taken over by people or the city, and compared with Schubert Park in Pretoria, must be something about its iconic status and profile. Perhaps you can comment on those. We have about 5 to 10 minutes. So maybe you can comment on those, and if there's a pressing question, we can take it.
Absolutely. Yeah. To Lucas's comment, I think it aligns with Prof. Noor's comment on thinking about real estate and property and investment, and where Ponte fits into that picture. There's certainly some scholarship by Osmanovic that makes an appearance in the paper on the Grand Apartheid political economy and the spatial mismatch of it. But I think in future iterations of this paper, I'd like to do a little bit more and think about the kind of rent gap and cycles of over or under valuation vis-a-vis Ponte. So I appreciate this comment and trying to kind of get to this riddle of why the investment here at that time, right, in 1975, and what is that? What is Ponte doing for investors and for real estate capital, so to speak, in a different moment, in a grander high apartheid moment that was stilted along a number of lines. And to Alison Wilson's comment, I certainly think that yeah, a number of other quote unquote hijacked buildings that did not survive in quotes. There's a worthy set of comparisons It's also worth thinking about maybe the similarities too, especially now. I think there's a new report by CIRI, the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. Many of you guys probably know it quite well, about the number of urban evictions and dispossessions that are happening just this winter in South Africa alone. And so perhaps, Ponte, like a number of these other buildings, was a site that was hijacked, and then development interests sought to rescue by way of dispossession the buildings for new and layered aspirations of urban living, which are themselves perhaps fleeting in their own ways. So it's I think a useful comment to kind of think through Ponte alongside many other buildings in the cityscape, and also in places like Pretoria.
Cool.
Sorry, Kasonde, I muted you by mistake.
Thanks. I don't know if you saw, Stefan, Njogu said your comments, it would be worthwhile to include that in the paper.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Thanks, Njogu, and I will, yeah.
Okay, my comment, really, these other comments were very helpful, I think. My comment is just a quick one on this idea of Ellis Island and other Africans coming to live in Ponte. In my understanding, Ellis Island was sort of this place where migrants arrive, but I don't know, perhaps you can correct me. I don't know what the stats are in terms of Hillbrow and neighboring suburbs. It's probably problematic, but people call them sort of urban ghettos and slums. So is the Ellis Island analogy accurate? Because Ellis Island implies people eventually move on to better places. And I wonder whether it's significant that other Africans, majority, I don't know if you have the statistics, but majority of the residents of Ponte right now are immigrants from other African countries. Is that significant, looking at the history of colonialism in South Africa? Other Africans were called foreign natives. I find that term very interesting. And now with Afrophobia and a recent mayor of Johannesburg, Herman Mashaba, really pushing that. Yeah, but that just comments.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, those comments, Kasonde, and I think the real answer is I'm not sure. And I think this is kind of being litigated right now in Johannesburg about, for example, opportunity, and whether it is Hillbrow and Ponte a sort of way station on the way to inclusion, or is it a sort of phenomenon of permanent ghettoization? And yeah, there are fantastic quantitative statistics from Lauren Landau and ACMS, the African Center for Migration and Society. You guys likely know that institution, and also Kihato has a more qualitative ethnographic account of the lived everyday of residents of places like Hillbrow, for example, and the statistics make clear that the majority of residents in Hillbrow today are from other African countries, and I think the Ellis Island reference, the quote of Ponte as a sort of Ellis Island, is a quote from Mikhael Subotzky in one of our conversations. And I think, yeah, whether that comparison to the United States holds true or not, I think is very much to be determined. Certainly, when a lot of immigrants came to New York in the late 19th century to Ellis Island, they encountered high density slum poverty that was quite challenging, with sanitation and electric conditions that were quite suboptimal, and a lot of disease but ultimately through contestation and political organizing and the progressive era, and not to make this history rosy, because it was also racialized, and a lot of these immigrants were able to be included as white. You had a story of broader inclusion, and I don't know if that's going to be the case in a 21st century Johannesburg context. But I think it's worth looking at Ponte as perhaps one of many symbols in that question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the great presentation, and thank you for the participants for really asking probing questions. If there's no real burning question,
Sorry, I see, Cassandra, there is one last question.
Oh, I just saw it, yeah, from Eric, yeah, Eric Wolby. Perhaps you could link aspiration to speculation in thinking this through. It seems to me that Ponte's symbolic force, its imagined potentiality as a total society, a heterotopia, its concentrated vertical mass, both physical and in terms of the thousands of people it could accommodate, lent itself to overinvestment, not only of money, but of a more inchoate desire.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, that's a superb comment, and I think there's a lot to think with there.
All right, well, it's 4:06. If there are no other questions, Stefan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. I learned a lot from your talk and from the discussion. And all the best with your paper.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your very incisive and helpful comments.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is the end of our webinar. It will be uploaded, a recording will be uploaded to the history workshops, YouTube and Facebook. So please look out for that. Our next webinar will be in a couple of weeks, and you'll receive emails. Yeah, so thank you. Have a good day.